Hi everyone. So I think we've probably got everyone that we probably will get on attendance. So I thought let's get started. Today's webinar, following on from the others that we've been doing throughout the lockdown, is starting to look at what we can do post lockdown to sort of make sure that we're using everything that we learned pre-lockdown to help us sell more and more effectively and more targeted as we come out of the lockdown and going forward, and how we can help our salespeople in making sure that they target the right people with the right products at the right time. Really excited because we've actually got one of our close partners, Sales Eye, Joe Cox from Sales Eye. He's well experienced and very knowledgeable in this area, of course, because that's the products that they sell. And he's going to give us a bit of an insight into how we can use data that we already have to portray information to our salespeople. And of course, coming out of the lockdown, how vital it's going to be to utilize all of that. And of course, knowing all of this information helps us use products like ours and any other way that you sell better, and you can configure it better to sell more. So I think we've got Joe on the call. Is Joe available?
Yep. Can you hear me okay, Roberto?
Yeah, all good. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to Joe, and he can take us through the presentations that he's prepared for us. And to share a bit of knowledge. One thing to also mention is that you do have the opportunity to ask any questions. If you hover your mouse over the screen, you should get a little pop-up that says Q&A. You can write any questions you want throughout the presentation, whether it's about our products, Joe's products, or just the information you're receiving in general, or anything else. Fire up a question. We've got a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So what we do is, if we can't answer it directly to you in that area, we will answer it live in the presentation. So feel free to fire away and answer any questions that pop up as soon as you think of them. So I'll hand over to Joe, and off we go.
Lovely. All right. Cheers, Roberto. Thanks very much. So thanks everybody for joining this morning. Very much appreciated. Just to get started and to add to what Roberto was just saying there, I'm very much going to be discussing elements of best practice around analytics. Obviously, with everything that's going on at the moment, it's particularly relevant when it comes to comparing performance pre and post lockdown. So we'll be talking about that as we go through. One of the things I will say straight from the off, just to talk a little bit about myself, a bit of a shameless self-promotion, you might call it. But the key thing I wanted to convey really is I'm not necessarily an academic in the field of analytics. Everything I'm really going to talk to you about today is really from experience. So as you can see on the slide here, I personally myself have been involved in the software industry for some time, for about 10 years now. I've had some experience working for vendors in the ERP space and sort of account systems. I've worked around CRM and analytics. And a portion of my career, I was working on sort of big data analytics solutions for some bigger brands, so people like Co-op and Burberry and Rightmove and these sorts of people. So I've kind of seen this conversation from a lot of different angles. So what I thought was best to do as we're having this conversation is give you a very coalface perspective on how I'm seeing companies speak about this subject and what they're doing, and hopefully give you some very, very much real life insights into how these sorts of tools and these sorts of processes are being used today in the industry, and obviously how those can be related to this post-lockdown market that we're currently looking at. As far as today, I'm currently the head of the UK sales department for Sales Eye. I won't talk about Sales Eye a great deal. I'll give you a quick insight into who we are, just to give you a bit of context. I think the main thing that you'll want to know is that we as a business and I individually have conversations every day with prospective clients or current customers around their sales process. A lot of that is obviously drawn around analytics, but it's all shapes and sizes of conversations. So I suppose I'm in the fortunate position of being able to hear these insights firsthand, and sometimes, literally hearing competitors talk about each other on separate meetings, which is always an interesting thing to listen in on. Don't worry, I'm not going to give away any confidential information or anything like that, but hopefully I can give you guys a few anonymous tidbits that might be of value. So to speak of the business briefly, SalesEye, the company, are a provider in the CRM analytics space. Company's been around 12 years itself. And all I will simply say is that we as a provider have over 1,000 customers in the UK, a variety of customers across different continents as well. And we do currently work with a number of brands across a variety of different industries and verticals. So as I'm sure you're aware, different industries have been affected in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways over the past 3 months. So I can perhaps talk a little bit about what that variety looks like and how different industries have adapted differently depending on their circumstance. All I'll say on any of this is if you want to know more, obviously we've got the SalesEye website and what have you that you're more than welcome to dive into. Now, to keep it on the subject of the webinar itself, let's get down to these 5 ways that we've alluded to already. So, first and foremost, what are the 5 ways analytics can help you sell smarter? Okay, so again, these are the things that I've come across just from personal experience, some of those constant pain points or those constant situations that I found myself having conversations about. So number 1, the obvious, comparing before and after. Okay, so I raise this not because it's a showstopper. I think everybody understands that, to understand how the lockdowns affect them, they've got to see before and after. But I'm going to use the time for this particular point to discuss whether that's possible for your business and how you might actually do it. It's a very easy thing to band about, but when the practicalities come into play, it can be difficult. Point number 2, data capture. So I think my conversation here is very much going to be around, is this something that every business is giving the proper respect to? Is all the data that you as a business leader would want available? And why is that? And what are the mechanisms in place for picking up the information that you want? Okay, and we'll talk through a few real life examples of that. Analytical customer management. This is always a good one, but very often nowadays and in the past, for years, in fact, I've always heard the immortal tagline, we want to be proactive, we don't want to be reactive. It sounds great, but if it's something that a business consciously wants to do, then they need to think about the way they manage customers, and analytics comes into that, and it's definitely going to come into it over the next few months. I think that the particular line that I've put on my notes here that I think sums it up is analysis separate to the customer experience? And we'll talk about that as we go through it. Number 4, new ways of talking to customers. Now, this is as prevalent nowadays as it ever will be. Can we have just, inverted commas, typical conversations with customers nowadays? Well, it's debatable, isn't it? What can be discussed and in what way is massively varied depending on the industry that you're in. And that's a conversation we'll get into. And finally, changing the way your business's sales activity is measured. Okay, so I'm thinking, looking inward at our own sales teams and how things are going to be changing. Appreciate that for a lot of businesses, they've had salespeople on furlough or they've had to adapt the roles of salespeople. So it's just a talk about how we should be measuring success really over the coming months and what that should look like. Okay, so appreciate this is quite an ambitious few points to get through. I'm obviously not going to cover off every single aspect of it. So we're going to do a bit of a buffet and just pick and choose some subjects to talk about as we go through. Okay, so point one, comparing before and after. Okay, so let's start with the basics. Do you have the data? Now, when I have conversations with businesses about analytics, the very first thing that is discussed is, well, you know, Joe, I can pull a report and I can see what we sold this month, and I can see what customers bought it. Okay. Now, don't get me wrong. That's a foundational part of what every business should be doing. I obviously see the value in that, but I think, like anything, analytics is a varying degree. You know, it's not whether you're doing it or not. It's to what extent are you doing it. And I think I could easily make the argument that there's a lot more that we could be getting from potential data other than just, has a customer bought something? Okay. I mean, the obvious example being, have they not bought it? But we'll get into that as we go along. Now, obviously, to what degree has your sales target been affected? Now, again, it sounds simplistic, but I think the question when I raise this statement, the question I'm really asking myself is it the same across the board? Right. So if you've got a varied customer base, which in fairness, I think most businesses nowadays will have some amount of variety, you're obviously going to have areas of your customer base that are effective a lot more than others, right? The obvious being, if there's a strong retail element to your customer base, how have they been affected? Now, have the customers with a strong e-commerce platform been affected as poorly as those without? So we start thinking about the different parameters, the different variables that are going to give you a true insight into what degree your customers have been affected, and consequently to what degree your sales target has been affected as a result of that, which naturally bleeds into, you know, what customers and products have changed in your estimation, right? Who are the customers that you looked at them previously and thought, yeah, this guy's a middling customer, he does okay. Now they might be your champions, they might be your heroes, they might be saving your sales number, right? And again, what are the factors that go into that? So to give you an example on this particular point, I had a conversation with a client just 2 days ago who are a supplier in the packaging industry. And without giving away all of their pertinent details, what I will say is I had about a 20-minute conversation with the sales director, and the term that he used was, our priorities have changed as a business. Okay, which I think it's good that they've obviously sat down and had that conversation, but what they've highlighted is that they have now product areas that they just completely didn't sell previously. So they've introduced these product areas seemingly out of nowhere, and they've completely changed the way that they effectively onboard a brand new customer and the way they track them. And they've done that as a result of a bit of introspection and analytics based on the first few weeks of the lockdown period and how that changed the way their customers were buying. As a result, the tagline that he gave me, probably quite proud of himself, is that they were actually 50% up in a product category that they practically sold none of previously. And there were other product categories that they had simply brought about from absolutely nowhere. So they'd managed to be agile as a business, right? Now, don't get me wrong, they're great. These are great success stories. These are great things to throw out as taglines. But in the end, those things are only possible if you can step back as a business and you can see the way the winds are changing, right? Otherwise, you can't make that pertinent choice to invest in those product categories and make those changes the way that you might need to. Okay. And finally, where has our business been coming from in lockdown? So I think the reason I raise this point is I can say this, from my own personal experience. I had a conversation with my CFO the other day around the success that sales I have had over the lockdown. And I think the conversation that we've had was that it wasn't the people we thought it would be. And do we think the people who were top prospects, top customers before the lockdown period began, are those people going to be coming back around once we get to more of a level of normality? Now, personally, what I would state in that particular regard, perhaps this is me being the glass half empty situation, but I personally am not going to stake my sales forecasts and my ambitions around people coming back to me on businesses having gone through that period of turmoil, but then coming back and doing the exact same thing they did previously. And I would counsel any businesses, in wholesale manufacturing distribution, I would counsel everybody to think to themselves, right, that top customer that you had before, they might not be coming back. So how can you adapt? How can you change in order to make somebody else that new top customer, right? Hence why understanding who have been these lockdown heroes for you is so important, because strike while the iron is hot, in effect. If we've had somebody come out of the blue, really support us during that period, what can we do to continue to spur that growth through that customer? So to give you an example of this, I do actually have some sample data here just to talk to you about. So if I just quickly flick across here. So first of all, I can tell you that this isn't for a particular client. This isn't any sort of breach of confidentiality or anything like that. And what I can tell you is that as I endeavour to go through this, guys, I'm not necessarily just going to throw you a ton of sales eye visuals either. So this isn't actually sales eye that we're looking at here. But what I did want to give you a bit of an insight into is the way that products and customers are changing in their priority. So you can see here, this, by the way, is a coffee distribution business. So I can see that a product that was, let's see there, 435th in its pre-lockdown ranking is now 48th in its post-lockdown ranking, right? So don't worry, we're not going to go through these visuals line by line, but what I simply want to state with my first point here around comparing before and after, I want to make sure it's abundantly clear that a change has occurred through organizations. Products and customers are going to have changed in their ranking, and we need to acknowledge that and adapt to it in such a way that if those changes if things don't reset themselves, I should say, we've adapted to this new step change. Now, you can't understand any of this without the value of analytics. Okay. Now, I'm fortunate here to have a lovely visualization piece that gives me that breakdown. So hopefully this will provoke some thoughts for you guys about the ways in which you could pull this information together and start asking these pertinent questions. Okay. Now, that segues me into my second point, which in essence is where this data comes from. Okay, and what data are you capturing at the minute? Now, I made a point earlier stating that a lot of businesses that we speak to have, should we say, that the baseline, i.e. they have a number of customers and they can tell me how much revenue that customer spent, and over a 3-month period. Great, fine. In my opinion, there are a lot of other things to factor in on that. If your data is too shallow, when you come to compare your before and after, you're not going to see a trend, because if everything's just amassed together, thrown in the same melting pot, so to speak, it doesn't give you the ability to differentiate, which is the challenge. Okay. So if I was to give any advice to any business, any B2B business in a wholesale manufacturing distribution space, the very first thing I would do or advise is you properly segment and categorize your customers. It is one of the most basic things you can do. And unfortunately, from the conversations I've had, it's one of the things that people rarely do. Okay. Now, just to pull back the curtain on this just somewhat, when I talk about segmentation, obviously there's things like industries. Okay. Depending on your market, of course, what industry does your customer operate in? Okay. Then horizontally, how do they operate? Okay. So in other words, are they retailer? Are they distributor? What's their type of business? What region are they based in? How has their particular region been affected? Okay. I mean, to state the obvious, ladies and gents, if they're in Leicester at the moment, right, I would expect their sales performance to be vastly different to if they aren't. Okay. The ability to capture this basic categorization is the difference between you spotting a trend or not, quite simply. Now, to give you a bit of a real world example on that, very often the first thing that people say is, how do I go about doing that? What's the practicalities of it, etc. One of the silver linings of lockdown for our organization is it gave us the chance to actually step back and self-assess our data, which obviously we tend to do quite regularly. But what you've got to think to yourself is, if you have 500 active customers that you work with, how long does it take to go through a list of 500 names and simply select a vertical from a drop-down list, or simply highlight what region of the country they're in, or et cetera, et cetera? It's not as much work as you think, and the results, the value from it can actually be quite tremendous. I'll show you an example of that in a second, an example of the sort of value you can get. Now, another aspect, another angle to think about when it comes to capturing data is specifically data around lockdown. Okay, so just to clarify what I mean by that, again, depending on your vertical, how has your customer been affected? Have they been open? Quite honestly, has your customer been open? Have they had salespeople on furlough or not on furlough? Have they got an e-commerce presence? Okay. These are factors that are going to show you a trend. Okay. It's going to show you what to invest in. It's going to show you, as per our conversation a moment ago, where that step change in the business is going to be. Now, I won't make particular assumptions as to what those trends are. I can say that I've noticed that people with a strong e-commerce presence have done well as a result of it. But I think, for you guys, the truth is going to be in the facts, right? If you do this categorization, if you capture that lockdown data, and then you do that retrospective and you look at those numbers over that 3 to 4 month period, those trends are going to reveal themselves. You're going to be able to put 2 and 2 together. It's not going to be just a jumbled mass of customers have bought products X, Y, and Z. You're going to be able to see, well, I noticed that customers X, Y, and Z have done well because of X, Y, and Z. And it's going to allow you to make those positive decisions. Another point here around data capture, communication. So this is a bit of a bugbear for me personally. Probably because I manage a sales team and I'm very much used to having these conversations. But just as important as evaluating the transactional aspect of your business, it is just as valuable to understand the human element. Okay. In other words, how much have we reached out to this customer? What have we? How often have we spoken to them, and what have we even spoken about? And what have the nature of those conversations been? Right? Because, as should be abundantly obvious to everybody, the way you speak to a customer affects the way that they buy from you. The way you manage a customer affects the way that they buy from you. So again, when I talk of these trends and bringing this up, the reason I'm raising this is because the way you've directly managed that customer could ultimately affect that sales figure. It's part of that trend. So it's important to understand what the touch points with your customers have been, to what degree, and how that's helped rejuvenate them as a customer, right? If for example, and again, a hard question to ask yourselves, but if you feel that potentially some customers may not have had that communication for all sorts of different factors, not necessarily of your own doing, that is going to affect their recovery as a customer moving forward. Okay. So as I say, hopefully I'm giving you a lot of food for thought as I go through this here, and present some more of the solutions as we go through. But just want to start sort of churning up the thoughts really in everybody's mind as far as what questions should be being asked really day to day, as far as how customers are being looked at and how data is being captured and where that data is, of course. As far as where that data is, my last point, and probably the most pertinent of all of this, is you can capture as much data as you want. You can have whatever format, whatever spreadsheet, whatever system. You can stockpile all this information. If you've got no way of visualizing it, it's pointless. It doesn't give you anything. It doesn't offer you anything. You know, if you as a management team can't see these trends that I'm referring to, it doesn't help you. If your salespeople can't understand the way that customer's been affected, it doesn't help them when they have that conversation, right? So as well as ensuring that the data is captured in the appropriate way, in a sensible fashion, and obviously being able to have the data relevant for those trends, it's also being able to visualize those trends, okay? So I do have an example that can sort of speak to the value of this, actually. I can tell you that this is a Sales Eye example, not a shameless plug, I promise. But just to give you an example of the sort of value. Now, just to explain, the visual we're looking at here, it's specifically for the building industry, for the sort of building contractor industry. So as you can see, we've got a number of product categories. These are product categories for the mock business that I'm showing you here. The bar represents effectively how this customer has performed in that particular product category over this set period of time. So in this particular example, I think we're looking at the first 6 months of the year. What the line represents, and this is the value of that data capture, the line represents every other customer who is categorized in the exact same way as this one. Okay, so what I'm saying there is, if in this example this customer is a builder's merchant operating in say the North, Yorkshire region, or whatever you want to call it, I can tell you with some certainty that whereas this customer operates at 6.25% of his spend is in building, I would have anticipated that it would have been 25%, because that's what all my other customers are showing me with their spend. You see what I mean? Now, this is probably the easiest example, actually, because all it is it's just a record of what type of customer that is and where they are, that gives me that trend, that line. And that line is immensely valuable. Okay. And we'll talk about other ways that we can utilize that trend when it comes to customers in a moment, as I get further through my presentation here. Right. So on to my next slide. So analytical customer management. Now, unfortunately, we've actually touched on a lot of these areas as we've gone through. Just to make sure I define what I mean when I say analytical customer management, I'm thinking about the processes that you put your customers through internally. Okay, I'm not thinking about the customer-facing element of it yet. I'm just thinking about the ways in which you decide you are going to manage a customer, your workflows, your processes that you go through, okay? Or lack thereof in some cases. You might be sat there thinking, oh, I don't necessarily have those processes, but that's fine. We'll have this conversation. So the first point that I felt was important to raise here, just to be sensitive to obviously this whole lockdown situation, is just to make sure that we empathize with the customer in some way, shape, or form. Okay. To give you an example of what I mean by this, as a very sales-driven individual and having conversations with very sales-driven people, there's a lot of talk about recovery. There's a lot of talk of, ramping up sales, selling as much as we can over the next 3 months to really help the numbers that have been poorer over the past few months. And I completely understand that. That's the sales way of looking at that situation. But let's not forget that our customers in a lot of these situations, they felt that impact. They felt it in all sorts of different ways and shapes and forms. So I think I raise this point simply to say that however you're going to manage that customer, let's make sure, particularly pertinently over the next 3 months, that we're not wasting their time because they have got big concerns. Okay. What you as a supplier aren't necessarily going to be top of mind in the same way that something like sales line might not necessarily be top of mind. And it's important that if you're going to be communicating, if you're going to be managing a customer in any way, shape, or form, you've got to have that in the back of your head. Now, leading on to that comes my next point, really, which is being targeted and specific. Okay. So with the first point in mind and appreciating the situation the customers have been in, okay, when we put our customers through a process, we need to be conscious that we can't be communicating with them, or we can't be getting in touch over every little thing. Okay, so you've got to have something to say, quite honestly. If you're speaking to a customer, the conversation cannot be, I'm calling you because I want you to buy something. Because you are just, your words are not going to land on sympathetic ears, right? Funnily enough, the trend I just showed you is a good example of this. It is helpful, it is insightful to be able to come to a customer and say to them, were you aware of this trend and how you're affected by that? So when I say be targeted and specific, what I'm suggesting that should be done is have proactive activity targeted around the subject matters that your customers will be interested in. Make it a proactive, consultative conversation so that the customer feels like they're being offered something. And now, obviously, analytics plays a massive part of this, because if you can use the numbers correctly, if you can, using the data that's been captured and visualizing that data and registering that trend, you can use the trend to educate a customer and help them feel like they're getting that added service level that the competitor who's just asking for the business isn't necessarily giving. Okay. One of the ways of making sure that we're doing that is through customer reviews and key objectives. Okay. If you can task your salesperson with looking through their customers and determining what those key objectives are, what are the things that we're going to address with this customer that first of all, they're actually going to be interested in, and second of all, that are an avenue for generating our business. What are those objectives? Because if we can determine those now, then that's going to give us a really good steer as to how we're going to manage that customer moving forward, and what touch points we're going to give them, and ultimately what effort we're going to put into all of this. And having already touched on my last point, sharing our knowledge. So, ultimately, if I'm targeted and specific, if I set those key objectives, if I manage my customer in such a way where there is a plan, I know what I'm addressing, and then I share that knowledge that we have driven through the analytics that we have, then it's going to change the way that we manage customers. Quite honestly, it's going to make the customer look at us differently as a supplier. Now there's already echoes of these conversations in the industry. The amount of times that will speak to a business, and they'll speak of their suppliers coming in and talking about their spend and going through details and what have you. This is already something that's already picking up steam. What I'm really saying through these points here is this is something that's going to be more prevalent with everything that's going on at the moment. Especially with people assessing their suppliers, assessing whether they're getting that value. Not necessarily just looking at the pounds and pence spent, but also looking at the added service levels. Having this targeted approach of managing customers is going to help your sales team come across in a different way. Now, I'm particularly biased on this point. There's a way that we at Sales Eye sort of evangelize this, that, you know, personally, I think really summarizes it really well. So whilst trying not to talk about software, one of the particular things that our customers do quite a lot in this particular area is they come up with regular pertinent campaigns around these sorts of subject matters. Okay. So I'll give you a real world example. Okay. So we might say, we might notice a trend. We might recognize that customers who operate in this certain vertical have had an increased demand on products X, Y, and Z. And we're going to specifically target our customers who meet that demographic where we've not seen an upturn in those products. Okay. So we might say everybody who's, again, I'll beat this drum again. Everybody who's got an e-commerce offering, an e-commerce platform, and we've not seen an upturn in their sales in these particular products, and we know that matches up, we're going to specifically target those customers. That's going to be one of our key objectives. Okay. It's then delivering that targeted list to your sales team. It's then having your sales team directly contact the customer with that agenda, and then it's measuring the results off the back of that activity. Okay. If you do that, then it's going to help your customer feel like they're not just one of several hundred. It's going to make them feel that extra service level. It's all under the guise of selling, of course. In the end, we're all out to sell something, but it gives you that sort of somewhat targeted approach. Now, keep our momentum. Point number 4. New ways of talking to customers. So again, to differentiate, whereas a moment ago, I'm thinking about the way that we manage customers through a process, I'm now thinking very specifically of actually what it sounds like when we talk to people, when we talk to customers, when we talk to prospects. Okay. I felt the need to put this first point on there just because it's something, again, that I find comes up on calls more often than not. Milk rounds. Yes, there's always going to be some element of calling in with a customer and checking in on something. You know, I think we all appreciate that. But as per the points raised on the previous slide, this is something that people are going to be more aware of. And the easiest example of it I can give is around visits. As I'm sure we're all aware, visits are something that are going to be fewer. They're going to have to be more targeted. And we're going to have to do more of our work over the phone as a result of that. Okay. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it's something that we should all be acutely aware of. Okay. Now, one of the things that's come out of the past 3 months that I think has been hugely beneficial in that area is most business people, or most, quite frankly, members of the public that you will speak to now, will have a good understanding as to what things like Zoom are, which obviously we're getting the opportunity to use today. It is not something that is considered to be strange and alien, as it was perhaps in certain industries before. I can tell you, having done a variety of meetings with people in, say, the automotive industry or engineering or what have you, you would, make a comment about an online meeting, and they would look at you slightly funny, which, it's fine. That sort of mechanism wasn't prevalent in their industry, and I get it. Whereas nowadays, pretty sure we've all seen the Friday pub quiz on Zoom. We've all seen those little circumstances where Zoom sort of come into the forefront. So people are aware of this now. And I've seen some businesses effectively use this to their benefit. Okay. So I've got 2 examples in this particular area. I spoke to a distributor, it would have been about 6 weeks ago now, when we were more prevalent in the lockdown period, who basically was hosting webinars and online meetings for their customers. Okay. Now, again, quite an obvious thing to do. Now, what they had particularly decided to do was they were aware that because of the nature of their customers, who weren't necessarily overly tech savvy, they had decided to put on 15-minute product demonstrations. 15-minute product demonstrations that they would host live over a webinar. They would get the recording of that webinar and they would post it through social media after the fact. And they would only communicate and target those customers that they knew had a vested interest in that product. Again, through trends and analysis and other mechanisms, they would define or refine that list of customers, that target market, and then what they then be able to do is say, we think you've got particular relevance for this particular webinar. We're doing a 15-minute webinar around this product area. Let's face it, it's an education piece. It's not particularly aggressive selling. And that's something that they had found massive success in, and they've actually began to do that every week, which I personally think is a fantastic idea. Having been in the software industry, and I'm sure Roberto is of the same thought, we've been doing online meetings for years. I think that's something that everybody should consider bringing into their sales process and adapting to your particular vertical. Now, whether you're selling to retail, whether you're selling to hospitality, whether you're selling to a distributor, the likelihood is they can watch a 15-minute video of your product and will, because it's a way of absorbing that content that, you know, perhaps wasn't done as much previously, to throw it out there. The other element, the other example I alluded to is, it kind of touches on my previous point, is around the way you're managing customers. So an example that I heard was of suppliers setting up regular Zoom sessions with certain customers. And it's not necessarily something you would do for everybody, but the conversation was, yeah, Joe, I want to have conversations with my customers about their key objectives. I want to highlight to them trends. I want to talk them through what we're seeing in the industry. And ultimately, I want to sell them something. I can't really do that on a 5-minute phone call. And I also don't think it's likely that I can do that through a visit. So what they had particularly decided to do was actually to set up quarterly one-to-one meetings over Zoom with their customers, and actually to go through a bit of a business review with that client. So it's almost imitating what would have been an offsite or on-site visit, and then turning that into something that's online, that's of a similar format, but perhaps slightly more structured and slightly more thought out. I've got some visuals and an example I can go through on that in just a minute, but I think it's kind of interesting to see how businesses have adapted and the way they're changing the way they're talking to customers. And I think those two examples for me are they're more innovative things that I've come across. And the last point that I felt was pertinent to put on here, and hopefully this is obvious to everybody, but I spoke with one of our suppliers, I think it would have been a week and a half ago, and they're effectively an online tool provider, like a web provider in effect. They were actually sharing with me, perhaps it was one of their key objectives, but they were actually sharing with me the fact that the traffic and the interest in their particular platform had gone up by a very large percentile over the lockdown period, over the past 3 months, and it had vastly changed their market. And I'm sure we'll all agree, whether it's from own personal experience, having ordered from Amazon all the time and not going to the shops or whatever it may be, online and digital marketing at the moment should be a premium. It should be something that is valued as a business. Now, it's not obviously replacing the sales element necessarily, but I think it's something that should be addressed. So and that webinar example is a great example of that. But there, of course, are others. But I think, although I can't speak to it professionally, as it's not my area of expertise, I think it's something that we should all be putting a concerted effort to look at, because however steep this slope is that we're looking at the moment out of the lockdown period, however long it might be, this is something that's going to be pertinent now, and it's most certainly going to be pertinent later. We don't necessarily know how that market is going to have changed over the next 6 to 12 months. We're going to be finding out. And I think the businesses that have an investment around these different mediums and these different ways of treating with customers, i.e. online meetings, digital marketing, and these sorts of reviews that I've spoken of, the businesses that dip their toes in those waters aren't going to be shocked when they have to adapt in the coming months. A couple of visuals I've thrown up here just to aid what I've just been speaking about. Something that we personally preach internally is when speaking to customers, considering all of the 6 points there on the screen. Okay. So ultimately, when having a review with a customer, when having that detailed conversation, making sure that some thought goes to each of those points and capturing that and considering that before you have that conversation with the customer. And also, in respect of reviews, it's how you can present a business review to your customer. It's considering, appreciate we've got all sorts of different businesses here on the call, but if I was one of those businesses where I wanted to do a business review with a customer and I've got the data, how would I present that to them? How would I package what I know, those trends and that analysis and that data? How would I package that data that I'm aware of to my customer in such a way that's going to educate them, that's going to make them feel more confident in buying from me, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of our customer spring pack that does this. Well, in their particular example, they've got this slide deck that they go through with customers. Let's talk you through what you've been doing with us and what we noticed. Personally, I think this is just a great example of it, really, as the sort of thing that you could do. Now, is every customer going to sit through, Tolstoy? No, probably not. But just giving them a handful of insights into things that you're aware of as a business are very helpful. And what I would add to that is that if this review that we're looking at right here is supported by the data in your business, the customer can't argue with it. And now I can't get into this enough. If you sit in front of a customer and say the trend is X, the customer can argue with you till they're blue in the face. If you then show them a simple visualization that shows them that trend, they can say, well, where have you got these numbers from? These could be pie in the sky. You can turn around and say, no, these are my customers. This isn't some statistic. It's not off the news, right? It's not something I read on an article or on a website or whatever. These are my customers that I'm selling to, and this is what we're seeing as a business. And that's slightly more powerful, as you can imagine. Okay, guys. Well, we're on our final point. I really appreciate everybody for sticking with me here. I appreciate this. There's a lot of information to go through, and you've had to listen to my monotone voice repeatedly, so I very much appreciate it. But don't worry, we're on the final point. So we'll go through this point. Start to think about the questions that you may have, of course, that we can address at the end in our Q&A. No question is a bad question, is all I would say on this. Point number 5, the way that analytics can help change the way we measure activity. Okay. Now, I've obviously alluded to the fact that already that more customers are going to be reliant on communication over the phone, and visits and what have you are going to be less prevalent at the very least. So one of the things that personally I find comes up in conversations all the time, and something that was relevant, pre-lockdown just as much as it is post-lockdown, is actually understanding how many connections we make with customers as opposed to calls and visits and activity. So I'll give you the sales eye example of this. So obviously we're a software business. We call out to businesses and encourage them to look at our software, through cold calling. And what I can tell you is, just by the nature of the way people are, I could have somebody on my desk that makes 120 phone calls a day. Okay, and that person may book one meeting. one online meeting, and that's great. Fine, great. I may also have one individual on my desk that makes 20 phone calls a day and books my one meeting. So in a post-lockdown world, as per the points I've already raised, I think we both know that we'd probably rather it be the 20 call person, because the 120 call person has heard a lot of no's and potentially annoyed a lot of people. So what it really came down to in the end, irrespective of how much activity both those people churned in, is it came down to how many times did they actually connect with the person they were trying to speak to and have a pertinent conversation. So I would encourage everybody, as they consider what KPIs look like moving forward and all the rest of it, to think about that whole connection KPI, because I think that ultimately that is the true determination as to how good the salesperson is. Ultimately, it's how many pertinent conversations they had, not how many times they, showed up and had a tea and biscuit, if you get my meaning. And which, as I've just illustrated, and that comes down to contact points. If there's a way that we can have a customer who effectively buys from us on a regular basis, and they're happy, and we're giving them that education piece, we're going through those key objectives, and we're outlining those consultative trends, right? If we can do all of that through 3 phone calls instead of 20, we'd much rather do that as a business, both because of the situation and the circumstances the customer is in, but also because we're not burning out our staff or wasting data. Okay, it's particularly pertinent with prospecting. There's nothing worse than wasting data, than giving a business a perception of us as a company that we don't want them to have, right? So consider that connection ratio and how it impacts on those contact points. Now, of course, I'm sure everybody on this call has probably done this themselves over the past few months, but internal meetings and conversations have dramatically changed, especially with the sales team. I can speak for my team that they're very rah-rah. They enjoy motivation, they enjoy a good laugh, a good time. They enjoy the environment of being in the office, and I think it's fair to say that they've probably taken a knock to their confidence the past few months. Everything that's going on, it's really made them feel like they've lacked that environment, that encouragement, etc. So let's all be aware that that's a problem, okay, and that motivation for salespeople is really important. So I would actively encourage, in a post-lockdown world, that there's more of an onus around having those communal conversations with the sales team, having those uplifting conversations, because it could be quite depressing out there, quite honestly. And you can speak to a lot of customers, and some of those customers, especially if they're glass half empty, we're going to tell you all sorts of negative things, and it can knock the salespeople. So whatever that looks like for you, I appreciate it depends on your culture. It might be the proverbial pub quiz on Zoom at the end of the week. It might be going to the pub itself nowadays, which I'm sure we're all glad we can do. It might just be any kind of motivational or uplifting thing that you can do with your team, because as per the last point here on my deck, what I can tell you is, as much as I've counseled as I've gone through these slides about being empathetic with the customer and not harassing them and being aware of their situation and taking that into account, you should do the exact same thing for your sales team. I'm not saying to coddle them. I'm simply saying that you've got to be aware that they've had that knock to their confidence, obviously not to the same degree. And whatever you can do to help them feel that wave of encouragement, or arm them, I would say, with those insights, it's going to make them feel more confident when they have those conversations. If you offer up those trends, those key objectives, I'm banging a drum here, but if you offer up those processes to your salespeople and support them with those, they won't feel as nervous when having those conversations with customers, or they'll feel more equipped, I suppose is what I should say. And my final visual, guys, just to illustrate one of the things that I spoke through earlier. Touch points with customers. Personally, one of the things I love, I will tout a little bit, this is a sales eye thing. Understanding touch points with a customer and how they are associated with revenue. Okay. I had a managing director say to me once, I'll never forget it. He said, Joe, if I could have a customer where I called them once every 3 or 4 months and they spent all the money they do with me and that was it, they'd be a great customer. And no, I completely get it. You know, ultimately you want to get to that point, right? It's good to know ultimately, as far as touch points, how much effort we're putting in versus what we're getting out. And if you've got a way of producing something like this that I'm showing you here, I would highly recommend it, because ultimately what it's going to tell you is how much bang are you getting for your buck, right? How many of those touch points are you having? How many times is your customer taking time out of their day to speak to you? And ultimately, what is it getting you, right? I think it's going to, ultimately what it's going to show you is which customers are more profitable coming out of the period, and who needs that time and attention and who doesn't. Okay. So just to conclude, appreciate I've covered my desired points, and obviously we've only really scratched the surface. My goal here was to offer up some food for thought questions, to talk about some of the examples and ways that I've seen customers do some of the things that I'm discussing, and hopefully give you some practical examples, I suppose, of what you guys might want to consider and do over the next few months. But as I say, appreciate everybody sort of sitting through and listening to all of this, and my particular perspective. I think we're going to open up at this point to questions and so forth, which I'll allow Roberto to manage. But look, I'd encourage everybody on the call, if there's anything that you want to ask about or pull me up on, feel free to do so, and happy to answer.
Thanks, Joe. I think that's really, really insightful. It's given everyone some food for thought, even me, actually. I've, although no one's written any questions in as we've gone through, if you have any, write them in the Q&A or the chat. I'll keep an eye on both of those. In the meantime, I've actually got a couple of questions I thought might help others. They might be sitting there thinking the same thing, but not writing the questions up. That's all right.
Yeah, of course, far away.
So one thing that struck me was capturing of data is great, and obviously the deeper that it goes and the more that we capture, helps you report better, I guess, is the bigger picture answer in terms of what you were saying earlier in the presentation. But one of the things I think that could be quite important is understanding that they don't have to capture new data. They could be utilizing information they already have. Do our clients need to start capturing?
Sorry, can you speak again?
Oh, can you hear me okay? Hello.
Oh, there you go. I can hear you now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's all right. Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can hear you fine. Sorry.
So one of the things I think would be quite good to ask was, do our clients, although capturing more data against our customers is important, then is there existing data that most of your, in terms of your experience with new clients coming on board or starting to look at and analyzing their own data, what sorts of things should they be looking at that they already have specifically, against customers and products, and things that are most common among your clients when they first come on board, as to what they can look at, just to straight away pick up some sort of analysis and help them sell off the back of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple of things that I pointed out through the presentation, which fortunately most people will have in some way, shape or form, the geographical. Okay, so naturally, if we're all, I think most people on this phone call will be shipping to customers, they'll have delivery addresses and all the rest of it. So if you want to get a grasp of regionally how your customers have been affected, that information will be available, typically by postcode. I know postcodes can be a little bit deceiving, but if you have a way of visualizing that data and looking at sales performance by region, that will really help you out. I think the other obvious one, and I appreciate a portion of this will be in people's heads at the minute, is basic product associations. So you guys will all be aware of the basic product associations that are relevant for your particular catalog or for your particular customers. If they buy X, they should buy Y. That sort of data is obviously easily available. And a third point, just as it comes to me, if you're the sort of organization that potentially sells within a network of businesses, so whether that's potentially some sort of group organization or perhaps a multi-site organization. In fact, if I jump back to a previous slide here, apologies as I do so. So if you're selling to a customer that's got multiple sites or locations and what have you, this trend that I spoke through earlier is exactly as relevant. So I'll throw out a name that we all know. So somebody like Juicen, if you wanted to look at trends or insights for an organization that has those sorts of different sites, you can obviously make it so that line in effect is on average what Juicen do in every branch compared to this particular branch of Juicen. Now obviously that's a building example, but provide with that delivery address data that you've got, you can replicate this. It's just obviously the way of visualizing it that's so crucial.
Yeah, it seems that's the sticking point, isn't it? It's finding.
It's and just to be clear, that's always the sticking point. That's always the difficulty. It's not easy to just get data and just turn it into what you want. There are various mechanisms and ways of doing it. I'll encourage everyone that's are sensible and not necessarily overly costly, depending on what you're wanting to do. But it's something that everybody should consider doing. So
cool. The other part that interests me quite a lot is the way that it's visualized for the salespeople to the customer, rather than just the company themselves figuring all of this out and visualizing it themselves. How it's presented to the customer in a way that sort of grabs their attention. So, in terms of your experience, again, how important is that? So, speaking to salespeople of your of your clients and things like that, how important and how much effect, sort of influence has that had on their sales?
Oh, massively. And I just to speak to that, I mean, I'm sure we've all been in those situations. We've all been in internal meetings. We've all been in that circumstance at some point or another, where somebody pulls up a spreadsheet and it's got lines and lines and lines of data, hundreds of rows. And you look at it and you think, I can't make head nor tails of this. Well, it's the exact same thing with the customer facing interaction. If you've got something that simplifies, and again, banging the drum, simplifies those key objectives or those key things that you have noticed, from having done that background on the customer, you're presenting it back to the customer in such a way that it's clear and obvious. That's really what you're after. You're after a way of sitting in front of a customer and saying, this is what we've found. This is what we've noticed. Here's a very clear graphic that shows you that speaks to that, has the data supporting it. What do you think? Now, don't get me wrong. I say this. I'm not ultimately trying to encourage people to become data analysts. I'm not encouraging sales reps, especially, to be data sort of analysis specialists. But what I would say is these trends are, the whole point of them is they're conversation starters. Ultimately that's what we're getting at, because there is nothing more, post lockdown, pre lockdown, there's nothing more stale than not having something to say, really, not having a purpose in that conversation, and having that visual, it gives you that, showing that to a customer and saying, we've noticed X, let's talk about it. It's a great way an open way of starting a conversation. And ultimately let's face it, it's a conversation that you've preordained, shall we say, that you're wanting to have. So it's not something that can just be hand waved necessarily.
Yeah. I feel like it's your salespeople are sort of the bottom of the funnel of your data. You have the sort of task of enabling them with that data, and once it gets there, if it's presented in the right way, I feel like when the other topic you're talking about is motivation, and giving them really specific information is a high motivation to sit in front of people and know exactly what to talk about at the right time. And those product associations as well, that, you know, it's almost vital. I feel like that's the great link between our two offerings, and you know, advice that we can give is that those, if you can figure out how to present that information, you can also hook that up to how your salespeople then, you know, right at the end when we're talking about, you know, the actual order taking, etc., whatever method is used for that, you're able to present at that stage, which is the right time to be doing it, because we know that we're capturing at that point. I think it works in unison, right?
Most definitely. And what I would say is, and I've got a lovely little, lovely bit of insight from yourself there, Roberto, but what I would say, and the way that, you know, obviously our particular partnerships come about and why we've had our success is because, you know, we obviously recognize that from a sales presenter perspective and from a Blue Alligator perspective, you guys are the experts when it comes to order capture, for sure. And, you know, managing those transactions and capturing that data, you know, and whereas Sales Eye, you know, as I'm sure the people participating are aware of, and I've alluded to, you know, our specialty is visualization. Our specialty is packaging and presenting information in a way to the sales team so that they can actually manage it and act on it. So, you know, I would, and obviously for those attending, I would say, you know, obviously Sales Eye is a great mechanism for doing that. There are other mechanisms, but it's something that everybody should be doing irrespective, and is really going to help sort of empower the sales team, really, as Roberto's just said. So
definitely. I think regardless of the methods you use to do it, and I'm sure Joe is available for a chat if you did want to talk about Sales Eye specifically.
Oh, of course, yeah, of course. don't worry, guys. I'm very much interested in that conversation. I'm trying to be as unbiased as I possibly can. But
I think even regardless of that, there is other ways you can look at your data. It's extremely important, especially now, to start thinking about that. You know, and figuring out how you present information to your salespeople. It's all well and good sending them out onto the road again, and picking up orders. But we also have to be considering the value and the volume in those orders, and how you can take advantage of every single opportunity in, like you say, as you've highlighted, geographical areas. I think the two things that I've learned is that probably the biggest part of all of this is to figure out geographical locations and what trends are in those locations, but also the associations of products. So how you're packaging each product to associate with others to upsell and cross-sell accordingly. I think that's, you know, clients should be doing that as default, to make sure that they utilize every single opportunity and not just throwing out product information and expecting people to know where to go and what to sell. Or we'd love to think that all our salespeople are experts in what they're selling, but sometimes they miss the odd opportunity when they're in a rush or they hit budget, or in all these little bits where actually there's an opportunity to win more business. I think, you know, these sort of toolkits are the best way to do that.
Most definitely, and yeah. So I'll take a second just to thank Roberto and the Blue Alligator team for giving me the opportunity to speak today. Very much appreciate it. And what I would say for those in attendance, if you do want to reach out, or you do want to learn a little bit more about the Sales Eye angle to all of this, and how we help clients do a lot of the things I've just spoken about, you know, feel free to reach out to Roberto, have that conversation, and we can obviously pick it up further. But yeah, just thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And if any questions do come up, you tend to find the best questions come up 30 minutes after the phone goes down, what I always say. So if those do come about, feel free to get in touch and we'll go through them.
Definitely. Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks, everyone, for attending, and we'll hopefully speak soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.